Hi everyone, you're watching the Virtual Amicus and I am Jay Lodha. So today's topic for discussion would be on travesty of modern democracy. And today, for the first time on Virtual Amicus, we have with us an academic. That's right, we have with us a very special amicus who happens to be a senior fellow at the Faculty of Law, University of Hamburg. We have with us Mr. Amal Sethi. And just to give you all a brief introduction about our amicus for today's session, he researches and teaches on comparative constitutional studies with an emphasis on courts, constitutions, and democracy. He's currently undertaking a multi-year project funded by the Hamburg Research Academy on the design of constitutional courts, how it matters. His work has been published and forthcoming in the Journal of Federalism, Indian Law Review, American Journal of Comparative Law, Modern Law Review, and the list goes on and on. Some of them being National Law School of India University Review, the University of Pennsylvania Journal of International Law. He's also been involved in several consultancy and advisory roles with with different governmental and intergovernmental agencies, ranging from U.S. Department of Commerce to UNESCO to UNDP to UN Women to UNHCHR, etc. and etc. He obtained his doctorate and master's in law from University of Pennsylvania Law School, Philadelphia, and during his time at the University of Pennsylvania, he was appointed as a legal writing fellow, a, a Salzburg Cutler Fellow, and the Global Women Leadership Fellow. So thank you so much, Mr. Sethi, for taking out time for the first academic to feature on my channel. How does it feel like? Anything that you wish to say?
Thank you, Jay. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real honor to be here. So tell me when I can start and I'll just go ahead.
Definitely. So the stage is set, Mr. Sethi. The floor is all yours. Over to you.
Okay, so I'll start with this one fact. And I think that's something, we should keep as a baseline. Most of you would know that in the early 90s, a very significant event happened that changed kind of the geopolitics and the entire structure in which the world worked, and that was the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, when the Soviet Union fell, this was the first time in history when the number of democracies kept on increasing at a very steady rate till about, there are different accounts, but somewhere between 2006 to 2009. That means more and more countries moved to a democratic system of governance. But after this period, and like I said, the date is a little hazy, but we can take it as the end 2000s. The number of democracies actually started declining. Countries that were democratic started becoming non-democratic. And what I mean by non-democratic, I'll proceed to that later on. And also another thing was there were some countries that were very established democracies, and they kind of witnessed a deterioration in the quality of democracy. For example, America. Now, a lot of their democracy indices that measure how democratic a country is. So America and France, which were perhaps very established democracies, have been downgraded to flawed democracies. So this trend started happening in the world, and in the last, I would say, 4 to 5 years, this trend has really been developing at a very, very rapid pace. So what I'm going to really today talk about is kind of explain this trend, discuss this trend. But before I really head to that, there's some conceptual issues we need to deal with. And, we love throwing around words. Often we say, okay, this is not democratic. That is not democratic. We are no longer a democracy. This country is no longer a democracy. This country is a democracy. So I think the first issue, really, the first elephant in the room is what exactly is democracy? Now, actually, there's actually no standard answer for that. In fact, there's this amazing book that I often keep citing, which is called Democracy. It's a 300-page book about all the different definitions of democracy. But most people in today's time, they identify certain factors that are very common to democracies and that separate democracies from non-democracies. Now, and it's also kind of essential to understand why these factors, which I'll go on to talk about, why they are essential. Now, I think the first thing that comes to our mind when we talk about democracies is that people vote in democracies. And that was the standard definition, the standard understanding of democracy for far too long, right from the Greek ages to the post-World War era. Then scholars and people who study these topics began realizing that just voting, free and fair elections, or just voting, let alone even free and fair elections, where one person, one vote, elected representatives, that's not a sufficient enough criteria to determine democracies from non-democracies. People in North Korea vote. Yeah, they vote every time for Kim Jong-un and he gets elected. So is Korea democracy? So there are three very essential factors that kind of are common to most democracies and that separate democracies from non-democracies. The first being free and fair elections, where there's a very realistic chance that you can actually defeat an incumbent. So the idea that you can actually defeat an incumbent realistically is very important to this definition. Because what happens, again, I use the example of North Korea, but there are other more subtle examples where elections happen, but it's impossible to defeat the incumbents because they've kind of rigged the entire system. They haven't allowed funding for political parties. The list goes on. There are a lot of ways in which they just control elections. Sometimes there's just simple vote rigging. So that's one very important element. But for this to sustain, there are two other elements that are very essential to democracies that kind of, separate democracies from non-democracies. The second being certain fundamental rights that are essential for democratic participation. Again, this is kind of blurry on what these essential rights are, but most people would say that's very commonly you need to put them in this box are rights like the freedom of speech, the right to form political parties, the right to vote, the right to assembly. Perhaps like we can take some of these rights as very essential, because without these rights, the first part of this definition becomes kind of illusory. Now, the third idea, which separates democracies from non-democracies, and which right now might not make very sense why it is an essential element, but I'll go on to my next point and then this would make more sense. But the third point that you need to know that is essential to separate democracies from non-democracies is some form, and again, I don't mean a very hard form, but some form of separation of powers. Again, what really is separation of powers is another discussion which can take another entire session, but these are three things to remember. Now the question is, what is authoritarianism? And this is where the third aspect of that element comes into play. Now again, authoritarianism is another term that we love, media, people, scholars, they love throwing around. A lot of times people conflate authoritarianism with a lot of other things, but authoritarianism, very plain and simple, is a system of governance where there's excessive centralization of power and there isn't too much rotation of power. There isn't, there aren't too many, there isn't political pluralism, for lack of better words. There are not too many competing opposition parties. So this is kind of the essence of authoritarianism. There are different strains of authoritarianism, but this is largely a factor that should be common to authoritarianism. Now, when we're talking about conceptual issues, like I said, this is what democracy means. But there's another very important term which has kind of, become very common and very popular in the post-World War era. That's a liberal democracy. A liberal democracy is kind of a subset of democracy, which you could classify as democracy plus. So a liberal democracy is a democracy with the three elements that I mentioned, but which also guarantees a lot of liberal rights, which advances the social welfare state, which guarantees rights like the right to privacy. So that's what a liberal democracy is. And in the modern, when I speak about the travesty of modern democracy, liberal democracy is declining as well, but by and large, democracy itself is declining. Liberalism is under threat in most countries where democracy is under threat. Liberalism is also under threat, but that's more to do with that the modern avatar that democracy took post the Soviet fall of the Soviet Union was more a liberal democratic avatar. A lot of earlier democracies were not largely they were democracies, but they weren't liberal democracies. So these are some conceptual issues, and I'll today not focus on liberal democracies, but rather just plain democracies. Now, before I really get into why this trend started, there's another term that I want to introduce you all to, and that's called hybrid regimes or competitive authoritarianisms. This is what most modern authoritarian regimes look like. countries like North Korea are outlier states. What happens in most modern authoritarian regimes or regimes that are moving towards authoritarianism, such as Hungary, Turkey, or modern day Venezuela, they are classified as competitive authoritarian regimes. Now, competitive authoritarian regimes which have elections, perhaps the elections might have certain degree of freeness and fairness, but it's almost impossible to kind of displace the incumbent. The incumbent just keeps on winning elections one after the other, and they in that process, by staying in power for a very long time, they pretty much erode all the features of democracy, and they centralize power. They do kind of the things which I said is associated with authoritarianism. So I think the thing to remember is most modern day, when we talk about Turkey is transcending towards an authoritarian regime, Hungary is also facing this brunt, or Poland is this is a trend that's happening in Poland. We are more talking about that these countries are moving towards hybrid authoritarian or competitive authoritarian regimes, rather than, again, full-fledged North Korea. I'm again using just North Korea very simply because it's this complete extreme example on one end of the spectrum. So I think, the question starts is, why is this decline of democracy happening now? How is it happening? So I'll answer this in two parts. So why is it happening first? Now, democracy had a lot of promise when, again, like I said, that one of the major events that kind of pushed forward democracy was the fall of the Soviet Union. Before that, there was another event that kind of pushed forward democracy. That was the end of colonialization in a lot of countries. Before that, it was the end of the World War. So there were three major events in history which kind of, whenever they happened, they were followed with a lot of democracies. So democracy came with a lot of promise. Obviously, there were certain countries that moved from a colonial system to a democratic system. There were certain countries that moved from an authoritarian system to a democratic system. Those are the ones more associated in the post-World War era. And in the post-Soviet era, there were a lot of countries that moved from a Soviet style of governance to a democratic form of governance. Democracy came with a lot of promise, but worldwide, people didn't see those promises being fulfilled. People thought that democracy would lead to better lives, would lead to better economic situations, would lead to more autonomy in their decision making, but it kind of didn't happen. And this kind of led, and there were other things about democracy people kind of didn't like I said, one of the more popular strands of democracy is the liberal democratic avatar. Now, a lot of countries like Turkey is a very, very good example of this. It is a predominantly Islamic society, but their constitution guaranteed secularism. Over time, again, I'm really oversimplifying things here, but over time, what happened was that secularism became kind of hyper secularism, where social expressions of Islam started being prohibited. So that kind of created a backlash. But by and large, what started happening was people just didn't think that democracy was living up to everything proponents of democracy promised that democracy would bring them, which is just a better life. Now this started happening all over the world: Latin America, Asia, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, even in America. It started happening everywhere. So by and large, every time this happened, a very charismatic leader comes on the block who kind of says that, okay, look, democracy isn't working, and or even if he or she is not that subtle about it, they would say that, look, your current system isn't working. You need some drastic, radical change. We need to kind of, overthrow the existing political order. The existing political order is corrupt. They kind of pitted the existing political establishment as the enemy, and they promised a socially beneficial future. And a typical example of these leaders can be Morales in Bolivia, Chavez in Venezuela, Erdogan in Turkey, Orban in Hungary, the Kaczynski brothers in Poland. So they were these leaders who kind of made these promises, and they promised to transform the system. often this transformation, sometimes they were very explicit about it. For example, Orban in Hungary actually said that, look, democracy is not working. We are going to like reform the society in a way where there's a single political party that's going to occupy the central power, and which is going to take decisions for a mutually beneficial future. That's going to be more better than the system where different political parties are competing against each other, forming weak governments. And then there were people like I would say Chavez in Venezuela. He didn't really say that I'm going to create an authoritarian system, but what he said is that the existing political order is in shambles. We need a better political order. I'm your man. I'm going to change things, and I'm going to like create this new constitution for this country that is going to put you on the path to a better Venezuela. But in that process, he did centralize power, and he did all of the things that constitution provided, all of the things that I said that is common to authoritarianism. So this is kind of like what lays the foundation for the downfall of democracy. But how does this? There's another question. So how does this erosion happen? How does this process of declining democracy happen? Now, that's another thing that's changed in modern days. I would say it's changed from the late 90s. When we talk about this period from the post-World War era to the 80s, 90s, the way democracy declined, and I think a great example to look at would just be our neighbor in Pakistan. Every time Pakistan made some progress, they had a military coup, and their democratically elected leader used to be toppled. It was replaced by a military government. Not every time, but a lot of times this happened. And this is kind of a story that is repeated all over the world. So earlier democracies' fall happened in these ways. It happened through military coups accompanied by force. But today it's happening in very different ways. So the kind of leaders that I mentioned, they come into power, they win an election fair and square. They win a free and fair election. Once they come into power, they can take two routes. They can either redraft an entire constitution. That's something Orban did in Hungary, Morales did in Bolivia, Chavez did in Venezuela. Currently in Sri Lanka, that's happening. And then there's a subtler route, the kind of route Turkey follows, where they slowly and steadily pass a lot of constitutional amendments. Poland is kind of even doing a more subtler thing where they're not even using constitutional amendments, they're using ordinary law. But what the actions that they do and the ends that they kind of try to fulfill are pretty much similar. So what do? One of the first things they do is they attack the courts. They completely remove the independence of the court. Can happen in various ways, but the essence being that they pack the courts with their loyalists. So that's one thing they do. The second thing is they kind of, if it's a federal system, if there's a federation, they start like centralizing more and more power. They start taking away power from the states to them. If it's a parliamentary system, they bring in too much power to the executive. Even in presidential systems, they try to take away power from the legislature and more concentrated in the hands of the executive. They remove other checks from their way, such as a lot of countries have independent ombudsmen, human rights commissions, offices that investigate corruption. They kind of even pack these institutions with their loyalists. They very slowly and subtly, in ways that it's not very evident, they sometimes even diminish human rights protections. But again, I think in 2021, a lot of would-be authoritarians have realized it doesn't make sense to do that. It just brings too much unnecessary attention. The best way to do it is just not enforce laws. So if the court passes a decision or there's something that we need to do upon your constitution, let's just not do it. Let's not just remove like the freedom of speech from our constitution. It makes no sense, just draws bad attention to us. So that's another thing they do. And again, they start like slowly rigging the election process. It can happen in a lot of ways, by capturing the election commissions, by redrawing election boundaries, by sometimes even just rigging the results of election. But these are what they do to retain power. And very slowly they transform the system using legal tools to transform this democracy into a hybrid regime. What they also in this process sometimes do is, and again, it's not something you can generalize for the whole world, but it's definitely something that's very common to these countries. in their constitutions or in their legal systems, they retain still a lot of very democratic values, a lot of very liberal values, and they do this with this twofold agenda. One, to kind of confound their critics. The critics will be like, okay, yeah, this is, we don't really know what the system is. It's got all these rights, but like we don't know what's happening here. It becomes a little tough to sometimes criticize them. But the second thing they actually do is sometimes add more social welfare provisions also to their constitutions and their systems. And this is more to kind of get buy-ins from certain constituencies that would support them. The best example I can find again is from Venezuela. It creates an authoritarian constitution, but at the same time, it creates a constitution that gives a lot of welfare rights to trade unions, to social activists, sorry, not social activists, I'm wrong there, but trade unions, labor organizations. There's a thing that's very common in Venezuela called neighborhood organizations. So they gave rights to these, and they actually enforced these rights because they wanted support from these groups for the project that they were trying to sell. What happens in certain other examples is that they will pass certain laws, and sometimes they can be religiously backed laws to, again, like, like perhaps promote freedom of religion, to kind of like in a country like Turkey, for example, so that they can get buy-in from religious communities. So this is another thing, authoritarians do. They kind of, and they use the tools of propaganda to continue maintaining support for their entire projects and winning elections, because they want to create that legitimacy. They don't want to be people who have just usurped power and be a Gaddafi or a Saddam Hussein or a Kim Jong-un. They want to be legitimate actors in politics. So this is how this entire journey takes place. And lastly, like, just a descriptive point, which kind of, I would say is something that I've been working a lot on, is how can we stop this? I'll start with this kind of negative point, that I'm not very optimistic about whether these trends can be stopped very easily. I don't think they'll be easy to stop, because the reality being that democracy has not lived up to its promise. A lot of people, a lot of politicians, a lot of actors who forwarded the democratic project, they weren't very true to it. They were corrupt. They couldn't, establish. They were power hungry. They were guided by self-interest. They didn't care for the welfare of the people, etc., etc., etc. So very big challenge would be to get these ways right. So actors in societies that support democracy, that forward the democratic project, or you can say even opposition parties. What I feel is that if you read kind of in countries that are backsliding, the term that you use when democracy is declining is either democratic backsliding or democratic erosion. In those countries, what is really necessary for proponents who support democracy to do is they really need to start selling again democracy as a project that's worth aspiring for. But at the same time, they need to clean their own houses. They need to put forward united fronts. They need to not be corrupt anymore. And sometimes they need to realize that people care about certain issues and those issues matter to them. So, don't try to take it away from them. And here the Turkish example can be a very good one, where people care about their own religion. Don't try to forcibly thrust, say, secularism on them. But again, it's going to be a very hard journey for a lot of countries that have backslidden to come back on a democratic track. And it would require a lot of missteps from, the so-called would-be authoritarians for these parties to come back. Because another important thing that I kind of forgot to mention is that while they're consolidating power and making it hard for elections, what they're also doing is they are putting they're putting, like, say, a great example is something as simple as this. They are charging their political opponents with tax crimes. They are diminishing the space for civil society to operate. So all these, it's just going to make it really hard for democracy to kind of get back on the step. But there are some positive signs in certain countries that, because there's still some semblance of elections, there's a possibility that you can win elections. There's another possibility where you can use the power of protest to force authoritarian leaders to resign, which is kind of what happened with Morales in Bolivia, though they have other problems, but you can use those kind of means. The list is very long how democracy can be reclaimed, but the larger point that I think I'd make is it's going to be very hard. It's not going to be an easy process, and if if given a second chance, actors who've kind of forwarded democracy, they need to remember from their past mistakes and not repeat them again. So this is kind of my summary of what I have to say, and I think now Jay can ask me questions that he would have on this.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Mr. Sethi, there for your valuable insights. A couple of questions that I have. Number one, do you think there is any hope for the future of democracy? And number two, democracy during COVID era. Do you think COVID has hampered the functioning, the governance part? Anything that you wish to say there?
I'll start with your second part of the answer first. So actually there's one of the institutes that measures democracy, and I know these democracy indices are flawed. They have their own problems, but they're still a good way to think about what's going wrong in which countries. They've published a report about democracy in crisis under COVID-19. And actually democracy has declined even more during COVID-19 because it's given executives a really fantastic opportunity to centralize power even more under the garb of solving COVID. It's been such an emergencies generally. COVID, often, especially in India, when we use the word emergencies, we kind of look back at the 70s, the declaration of emergencies. But emergencies can just be any moment of national crisis where you require extraordinary attention. So if we, use that simple definition, the COVID pandemic is an emergency. And there are a lot of countries who declare an official emergency, but a lot of countries didn't. A lot of countries didn't do because their constitutions didn't have provisions that would allow you to classify the pandemic as an emergency. But for very simple terms, it was a national crisis. It was an emergency. It required extraordinary action from governments and countries where authoritarianism was growing. The governments used it as a very good opportunity to centralize power. So that is definitely happening. COVID has been a big kind of attack for democracy. As long as the second thing that you mentioned, I kind of even alert to it when I was concluding. There are a lot of people who are way more optimistic than me. I am not, because this is completely an in my opinion thing. I think countries where democracy is declining, to get them back on track requires a lot of effort. And that effort has to be done by someone. That someone often are opposition political parties. And in all these countries, even when, authoritarians have come in pictures, again, you can look at, Turkey, you can look at countries like Hungary, Brazil, Poland. These leaders came in for a reason, because their existing political orders were in shambles. In some countries, 20 years have passed, and these parties have still not been able to get their act together. They're still infighting. There is still power struggles within their own parties, in parties that in the short-term future have no realistic probability of winning elections, but still people are fighting that when we compete for becoming the president or prime minister, it's going to be me. They are still embroiled in their own corruption scandals, etc. So like I said, it's very possible. There are examples where a democracy backslided and then it got revived. There are a lot of examples from all over the world, but the process is going to be hard. And my reasons for optimism is that it's, like I said, you need someone to kind of reclaim democracy back, and those someones are not there in a lot of places. And also there's another very important thing that while we consider democracy as a lot about like everyone has a share, a lot of times at the end of the day, the governance structure of a country is run by the political elites and other influential people. They are the ones who are really involved. In a lot of other countries, because of the kind of quid pro equation, the informal quid pro equations that have developed between would-be authoritarian and other influential elites, business leaders, etc., people who have the power to kind of, let's say, fund an opposition political party, or kind of bring about other changes in society, they are benefiting from some of these regimes. So they are okay with it. They don't want to go back to another regime where it was harder for them to operate. And so a lot of influential power holders, they are also kind of okay with the regimes that are kind of sprouting all over the world. So that's another thing. My optimism is not very high. I feel that this trend will continue, but I hope I'm wrong. I mean, there's some issue. Obviously, like at the end of the day, I'm also a human. Like a lot of other people, I don't like to be wrong, but this is one issue where I genuinely like really hope I'm wrong. Though, like I said, I do have some. I do think it's very possible for this trend to change, but my optimism levels currently on the lower side. But yeah, I'm more than open to that optimism level becoming high. I'm not going to make a solid claim like, you know what, it's the end of democracy. Now we are going to be in this new world where democracy, I mean, people have made that claim that now we are in the new China world where like countries are slowly going to move to the China form of. I'm not going to make such a broad claim. I think these are very hard empirical claims to make. I think the best thing to say is that we just need to wait and see how things are going to play out. But the trend where the number of democracies were increasing and they were thriving, they were improving, the quality was improving, I think that's going to be hard to change. I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you so much there, Mr. Sethi. One last question, because I'm too tempted to ask this question. If you have the time and we can move forward with this. So you're a senior fellow at the Faculty of Law, University of Hamburg, Germany, and you have so many publications to your name. You've also adorned so many different roles, from being consultancy, advisory roles with different governmental and intergovernmental agencies, such as UNHCR, etc., etc. And so, what would be your advice to all the young lawyers and law students who are watching this, who want to obtain their doctorate and masters in law from a prestigious law school like you have done? What would be your advice or your secret success recipe that you wish to share with all of them?
So I would say this, that I think this is actually a question I pretty much like have someone mailing me or messaging me on almost, I would say, a daily basis asking. And I really very simply say this, pursue whichever career you want to. If litigation is something that makes you happy, don't like go with the herd and be like, okay, I'll do this, whatever this means. Let's say let's just for the sake of examples, it's a corporate job. If you think you'll be better off in litigation, do litigation. If you think you'll make a great corporate lawyer, do it. If you think, and when it comes to academia, I think if you enjoy research, if you're passionate about certain things, then do it. Because if you're not, if let's say you are fascinated, I mean, one very common query I get is, I want to do a doctorate, advise me or whatever. And I often ask like, why do you want to do a doctorate? And after like a lot of like people will make these like fancy claims that I want to do this, I want to do that. But at the end of the day, like coming roundabout, it will come to this. I think that doctor tag would look good on my name. Like when I come back to India, I'll get like some respect with the doctor tag. That's a really stupid reason to do a PhD. Do you want to spend 5 years of your life researching on something super niche? To get just a doctor tag in front of him, that's just a bad utilization of your time, because you're not motivated to really meet the end goals of what a PhD can take you to. Even that 5 years is not going to be that 4 years, 5 years, how many years it takes for your doctorate. Even that is not going to be a very productive thing. So I think the advice I give to people is, if you think you're passionate about it, then start going ahead, and then start, kind of, I mean, it's very hard to really give an answer to, okay, what's the template to, and I'm also too early in my career to perhaps give the answer, what's the template to success in a field. I hope 20 years later I can answer that question, but at least like, okay, if someone asks me, okay, how do I reach at least to the level that, or do the things that you've done? My very simple answer to this is that reach out to people who you want to, at least at like that stage of your life, want to be like, whose kind of resume you want to ape, and ask them, okay, and I mean, even like when it comes to doctorates, you can do a doctorate in the UK, you can do it in the US, you can do it in Europe, you can do it in Australia. It's a very different process in every country. How do you crack programs? They aren't simple answers, but like what I think I can say that would be helpful is reach out to people. The worst that can happen is they won't reply. That's literally the worst thing that can happen. So find people on LinkedIn, find people just on university web pages, send out as many mails as possible. Like there was an Indian doctoral student at Penn who was there when I was applying. He was very helpful to me in trying to like figure out the nuts and bolts of how do you like go about applying within this law school for a doctorate. What does your proposal require, etc. And often, like, as things are getting more competitive, there are other requirements that doctoral programs are looking at, as certain, such as like publications or I would just say or perhaps even sometimes some kind of research work experience. So those are other things like people interested in such careers can look at kind of developing. But again, in a given time and space, requirements change. What's the template to crack a doctorate changes. So it's really more relevant for people to kind of really seek out to people who are perhaps even at that universities at that time and space to understand like how these processes work, because they keep the process. Perhaps even at my university of where I got my doctorate from is completely different when I actually applied to what it is today. The standards have increased. I feel like with the resume I had when I applied, I wouldn't have gotten today. I would have to do something else today to get in. So these kind of answers keep changing. And then there's a second aspect to your question about like also, okay, I'll also, I have to mention this because I think this is true for like pretty much every profession. Some degree of success you always owe it to luck, and sometimes you just need to be at the right place, right time. Certain, perhaps it just happens by serendipity that you apply for this job where exactly they're looking for someone like you. So those things are very essential. Or even a PhD program, like, it's very important PhD programs to kind of have a doctoral advisor, and you just click with a particular advisor who shares very similar research interests as you. So these kind of luck factors are very important, and it's really unfair to discount them. That's the first thing. Now, the second thing about I'm not someone who works full time in the UN. So like I would, though I've like been involved with a lot of UN projects, and I think there are two very different aspects. Often, like, people ask me this question, okay, I want to work at the UN, and how do I go about it? That is very different from the kind of roles I've been involved with in international organizations and stuff. Most of my work has been advisory, has been consultancies, some paid, some unpaid, some honorary. And those, a lot of them have been through invites to take part in projects, which often like stem from either people knowing about your expertise or you knowing people who know that. And again, it's very essential in any field. I just, not only academia, I'm like very sure as a litigating lawyer, you would say the same thing, that developing contacts matter. That's how you get clients. And I think, when the kind of roles I've been involved with, a lot of times it's people who I know who work in these fields who said that, oh, you know what, there's a new constitution being drafted in XYZ country, and we need someone with this expertise to perhaps write a report for it. So sometimes it's materialized in that way. Another time, there have been someone more senior to me who was perhaps hired by one of these organizations as the lead person in this project, and they've involved me with it. But now, like, after a few years, you've kind of developed those networks, you've developed that a reputation. So a lot of these start coming your way. You're often invited to be a part of this project. So that is very different from working full-time in the UN, which is a very different path, which is a very different track. It's a very different trajectory. And I feel like for that, often you do need a foreign master's to just get into the door, because just there are different ways you can really work with international organizations. And I would kind of highlight two different ways. The first way is that, and I know a lot of people would be very familiar about the fact, and they cry about the fact, that United Nations has unpaid internships. They don't pay their interns. So the one part is that you kind of, you do your master's. And again, it's a very different question, especially I'm very sure most people watching this would be law students. I think that's another very complicated question that, again, I'm more than happy if like someone reaches out to me and asks a discussion whether LLM is the right degree for that. I have my like little doubts on whether LLM is the best degree if your goal is to work in the UN. I do think someone would be better suited with a degree in international relations, for example. or something that gives you some other skills like master's in public policy or a master's in public administration. I sometimes feel, but again, this is a topic really depending on what is the exact role that you want to work in, because often people are like, I want to work at the UN, but like, what do you want to do in the UN? Do you want to um, be a part of the pantry team in the New York office that's working at the UN, or do you want to do administrative work in the UN? I'm not, again, this in no way is me putting down administrative work. Sometimes administrative jobs pay way more than research jobs. That's a reality, because sometimes a lot of people who are good at research skills are really bad at administrative skills, and a lot of times things work because of people in the administration. So there are a lot of different aspects. I think a lot of times we are very kind of guided by these names and want to be associated with these names and brands. And I think for students listening to this, it's very essential to kind of identify what precisely is it that you're interested in doing at these organizations or with, and then from there, think about the kind of master's degree that you want. Now that's one part. The reason I think master's degrees are essential is, very sadly, our Indian colleges don't have that independent legitimacy on their own that can help you crack the door. So you often need a brand, as sad as it sounds. So that's the next step. And then there are two pathways. Like I said, the first pathway is you apply for unpaid internships and you kind of keep doing them if you have the financial background to do them. I know, like, again, that's a hard journey for a lot of people. Do unpaid internships till you kind of get the work experience that's required to apply for proper jobs in the UN. Also, sometimes that helps you develop those connections to kind of identify which jobs to apply, to know kind of the entire processes to apply. A lot of times UN, unlike a lot of other jobs, they have more set procedures, but still being in the know-how helps. The second option, which I'm actually a bigger fan of, and I've seen some people have done really well taking this option, is that get your master's. And I'll now answer this more in the Indian context, because again, because of the viewership. Come back to India, work perhaps with the government, work perhaps with a think tank, work perhaps with, if you are more interested in the social work side of things, work with organizations like Pratham. If you're interested more in like a little bit social consultancy, work with organizations like Dasra, Dalberg, etc. Get some work experience, and then apply for jobs. Get that kind of solid work experience, because you'll grow much faster in India, and you will at the same time not earning money. And I think that's another part that people are being very receptive about, organizations, and especially when you actually end up getting very good on ground work experience in these kind of roles. Again, really depends. The correct role to do really depends on what is it that you want to later apply to. Also, a lot of times law students need to remember that not all jobs at organizations like the UN and sub UN organizations are organizations with which really want lawyers. Like one thing I kind of want to make clear is somewhere after law school, I developed a lot of fascination with quantitative skills, statistics, etc. And I kind of developed these skills, took classes in them, did reading about them. A lot of my current work does involve things like statistical analysis. It involves game theory models. It involves, other quantitative research techniques. A lot of projects I worked on are because of these skills that I have, along with the fact that I understand law. So a lot of times you have to remember that, like, a lot of these roles just don't want a plain lawyer who knows how to kind of read the law and has this kind of little knowledge of, say, international law or international children's law, whatever. So this is not a simple answer. And I know I've gone very long with it, but I think it's very essential. And I think, like, I go back to this point that having conversations with people, doing that is very essential to kind of identify. So if someone is interested, I think the first step for you is to reach out to exactly someone who is doing something that you aspire to do, at least in the short run. That's the best suggestion I feel I can give to someone. And the same applies for, like, academic jobs or etc. And I think perhaps you could add to it. I think that answer kind of stays true even if someone wants to work in a corporate law firm or wants to litigate. That just reach out to people and ask them how to go about things.
Yes, and I think it's very important for to all the viewers who are watching to understand. You really very nicely spoken about the importance of reaching out to people, and not just seniors from your own law school, but even seniors for that matter from other law schools. Number one, and number two, having meaningful conversations with them, building contacts with them. That is how you build a network. That is how you can build a solid network there. But sometimes, Mr. Sethi, I feel that it's people generally don't respond back. Every time you write an email to them, they are also busy. They have their own commitments. So, but I think that's the only way to look at things. And I also feel, and I strongly believe in the elimination method. So when you work and when you do something, you realize and understand whether you're passionate about it or not. And
Yeah.
when you decide, so you start eliminating things that you're not passionate about,
Yeah.
and eventually you're left with something and you build a career out of it. I mean, it's obviously easier said than done,
Yeah.
because we graduated at the age of 23 when you were in a 5 years lost or 5 years course. So, but I think that is how it is, and that is how it should be. And if nothing else works, then please like, subscribe, and share the virtual amicus. You
Yeah.
have speakers like Mr. Amal Sethi to guide you, to assist you always. Feel free to write to us for any of the queries. Mr. Sethi, before we bid goodbye and before we wrap this up, anything that you wish to say? Uh,
I just say this, that I actually agree with what you said. I also want to conclude this, that often, someone like me, I felt that I was lucky to find kind of what I was really passionate about very early in my law school life. For others, it's an elimination process, and that's fine. Most people who reach out to me reach out, especially with academic careers, who generally now want to work in academic careers. They reach out after like perhaps 5 years in litigation, 3 years in law firms, and realize that it's not working for them. uh, it's good if you figure it out early, and it's but that's life. And the second thing that kind of what Jay
yes,
alert
yes,
to is that
yeah.
often people don't respond. And to that I'll say that yes, often people don't respond, but you kind of need just one good person to kind of respond to you and guide you. And if you don't try, that's not going to happen. Like no one will respond. So I would just say that, like, remove that inhibition of reaching out to people, and that's something that's helped me. Like I've actually, I'll be very frank, I've been quite kind of very blessed to have like a very high number of people responding back to me, be it like just when I started like law school. I mean, uh, I actually was telling this to someone the other day, that when I started law school and I wanted to move, I was in the library and you were sitting, and you were like 2 years senior to me, and you helped me in my like first mood of just like which book to pick up. So like those kind of things, like I've been very lucky to always like find like someone to like give me some suggestion. But yeah, like I always like just encourage people to reach out. Worst case, they don't respond back.
We hope that doesn't happen. We hope things change. We hope there is reform, there is human revolution that happens, and then people help. So thank you so much, Mr. Sethi.
Welcome, and
Once
thank you for
again,
having me.
of course, my pleasure. And stay tuned, everybody. Next episode is on its way. It's goodbye for now.
Okay, bye bye.
Bye.